All right, so now we're going to begin our discussion on the nervous system terminology. So, for an introduction to the nervous system, what you see on the screen right now is the central nervous system. The central nervous system is going to be made up of the brain and the spinal cord only. Everything else is considered peripheral nervous system. So, you can see the brain is essentially divided up into three main parts. We have the cerebrum, which I'm outlining with my mouse right now. We have this cerebellum, which exists here. And one thing to note about the cerebrum is that the cerebrum pretty much does what we would call all of our higher order functions, okay? The frontal lobe tends to be involved with things like memory, as well as motor function. The parietal lobe is going to have a lot of functions in sensory, with these primary sensory cortex. The occipital lobe is going to primarily do a lot of work with vision. And then the cerebellum, the next part right here that I'm outlining, the cerebellum does a lot of work with coordination of body function and movement. And then we have the brainstem, which is made up of three different components: the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The brainstem is what we would call our primitive function center. It controls, for the most part, the absolute basic parts of life, like breathing. It can influence heart rate and other automatic type functions of the body. Now, once the medulla oblongata passes through the hole in the bottom of the skull called the foramen magnum, you are in what is now the spinal cord. The spinal cord is continuous with the brainstem and is therefore continuous with the brain itself. At the bottom of the spinal cord, we have what is called the cauda equina, which literally means horse's tail. If you look at it, it kind of looks like a horse's tail. It's pretty much just the end of the spinal cord and the final spinal roots that come off in the lumbar and sacral spine. Now, surrounding the entirety of all of this is what's called meninges. So you might have heard of something like meningitis before. Meningitis is inflammation of the meninges. Okay? There are three meninges. There's three layers. There's the dura mater, the outer layer. If you think of dura, think as tough. So it's thicker, it's tougher. Next is what we call the arachnoid mater. It's called the arachnoid mater because it actually, when you remove the dura mater from the top of it, it actually looks like a spider's web. And this is much thinner. Then the next layer is the pia mater, incredibly thin. In fact, by hand, it's essentially impossible to remove only pia mater from the covering of the nervous system. Now, within the meninges, we have cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so remember, think of the name cerebrospinal. Cerebrum, spinal cord, and fluid. You can kind of think about it as the it kind of does several things. It helps cushion the brain when there's shock waves. It also transports nutrients, and it, as part of transporting nutrients, also will remove waste from the area. So now as we look here, pretty much everything else, all of our nerves, are considered part of the peripheral nervous system. Even the cranial nerves, the nerves that come directly off the brain itself, are peripheral nerves. Okay, so what you'll see here is a very basic outline of where all the nerves go. If you'll notice, it's really easy to see in the thoracics, but each root of the spinal cord essentially supplies very specific areas of the body for sensory function, and we call that a dermatome. So, how the nervous system functions, essentially there is change in electrical potentials that causes a electrical signal to be sent down the neuron. And when the electrical signal reaches the end of the neuron, called the synaptic terminal, it releases what's called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the way that neurons communicate to each other. So when the neurotransmitter gets released from what we call the presynaptic neuron, it'll bind to the postsynaptic neuron, and that binding causes the change in electrical charges, and another action potential is sent. Very quick process. So essentially, what our nervous system does is it controls and it integrates different bodily functions together. Like a good example of that is communication. So if you think about the idea of communication, we not only have to understand the abstract idea of what a language is, but we have to be able to put words together in ways that make sense, and then we have to use a very complex system of motor functions to actually be able to speak. So, getting into the actual terminology. Cephalo, head. Cerebro is cerebrum, sometimes generally just refers to brain. Encephalo is another term for brain, like encephalitis. Meningo or meningio both mean meninges. Myelo is spinal cord. Phaso is speech. Plego is paralysis. Polio is gray matter. Specifically, it technically only means gray, but when referring to the nervous system, it specifically means gray matter, because within the central nervous system, we have what's called gray matter and we have what's called white matter, and it's the differentiation between gray and white matter depends on a protein that exists called myelin. And then psycho is mind, because it's important to remember that the nervous system and our psychiatric function is part of our nervous system. They're separated by specialty. You can kind of think about them as two sides of the same coin, with the coin being our nervous system itself. One side is the basic functioning of, our simple ability to move and speak and do basic functions, or on the other side is disorders related to essentially what makes us human, personality, disorders of personality, disorders related to all kinds of different functions, higher order functions. And then quadra is 4, so it's important to think about quad in general meaning 4. We tend to use certain terms when people have paralysis. So you might have seen the term quadriplegic. That's somebody who has paralysis of 4 limbs, because remember back, plege or pledge is paralysis. Prefix is hemi, is half. So we talk about the brain having hemispheres. The cerebrum and the cerebellum have hemispheres. Again, poly, many or much. We've covered this one before. So words built from word parts. Aphasia. What does aphasia mean? It means without speech. Cephalalgia. Cephalic, pertaining to the brain. Cerebral, again, pretty much same thing. Cerebral thrombosis, this is thrombosis in the brain. Dysphagia is a dysfunction of speech. Encephalitis is inflammation of the brain. Hemiplegia is actually very interesting condition related to issues with hemispheres forming. Meningitis is inflammation of the meninges, very separate from encephalitis, because encephalitis is actual brain tissue inflammation. Meningitis is just a meningeal inflammation. Meningocele. So meningocele is a type of spina bifida. Okay. So what you see here, as I described before, this is the basic spinal cord layout. So you'll see within the spinal cord, we have a nice little butterfly shape. That is the gray matter. Surrounding it is white matter. And remember, the differentiation between that is the presence of a protein called myelin, which you'll learn about in anatomy and physiology. Now, with the meninges illustrated here, I can discuss cerebral spinal fluid. So we have the dura mater, the outer tough layer, the arachnoid mater, and between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, which again, pia mater directly covers the neural tissue, we have a space filled with cerebral spinal fluid. This space, being under the arachnoid mater, is called the subarachnoid space. Okay, so really there's kind of 4 layers to the meninges, while there's only 3 actual meninges. Okay, another thing I want to point out is our spinal nerves essentially have a ventral and a dorsal component. So you can see the ventral component right here. And you can kind of get an idea that going back here is a dorsal component. Typically, ventral is motor, and dorsal tends to be sensory. There are a couple times where those rules are broken, but for the most part, that's how it works. And what happens is we have what's called the spinal root ganglion, where they actually both meet, and we can have integration of things like spinal reflexes here. And then they pass and continue moving on. And at that point, it's called the spinal nerve. So, meningomyelitis. This is just, again, an inflammation of the meninges around the brain. Neural, this just is applying to nerves. Neuralgia is pain of the nerves. Neurasthenia, neurologist, neurology. Poliomyelitis. Now, poliomyelitis is literally what we would refer to as polio. Polyarthritis, polymyalgia. So what we see here, neuralgia, typically we see this as a side effect or complication related to a disease called shingles. Now, shingles is basically chickenpox as an adult, okay? So what happens is it's caused by the herpes zoster virus, and once you get the infection, it actually will live in the spinal ganglion, essentially for the rest of your life, and it can randomly have flare-ups. And shingles is interesting because we typically see it present. It's a little exaggerated here, but we tend to see it present in a very specific way. If you notice, the vesicles for it tend to be in very specific areas along spinal nerves because, again, it goes inactive and hides and essentially hibernates in spinal nerves. Now, with shingles, once the vesicles have kind of crusted over and are no longer oozing anything, and the healing process has begun, you have what's called a post-herpetic neuralgia. It's typically presents as a very intense burning pain. and it can last for weeks following the infection. But it's interesting because shingles will present typically along individual dermatomes. And remember, dermatomes are the skin areas associated with only one spinal nerve. Okay? So, again, if you follow through here, the main area, notice how a big chunk of the vesicles are kind of along this spinal nerve here. So, think about this. What happens typically when you eat frozen food too quickly? You get brain freeze, right? So, what is the medical term for brain freeze? It is, and you don't need to know this for this week, but it's just a fun fact. It's called sphenopalatine ganglioneuralgia. All right? So think about it. Break the term down. Algia talks about pain. Neuro is nerve. Neuralgia is pain of the nerve. So nerve pain of the sphenopalatine ganglion. And remember, ganglions are just clusters of nerves. And the sphenopalatine, the sphenoid bone, is a bone of the skull. And the palatine is also another bone of the skull. So the sphenopalatine ganglion is literally a ganglion that's next to the sphenopalatine. It's brain freeze. So, cerebral angiography. We should know what an angiogram is. This is literally just blood vessel. It's a cerebral angiography. We're taking a picture of the blood vessels in the brain. Electroencephalogram. So what is an electroencephalogram? Think about this. This is an EEG. It's basically, for the brain, what an EKG is to the heart, and what an EMG or electromyogram is to the muscle. Okay, so we're able to look at the electrical activity of the brain. So another version here, electroencephalography, myelogram, myelography. So, Alzheimer's. With brains that have Alzheimer's disease, something to note is this is kind of a bad representation of it. But in Alzheimer's, as I'm sure most people know, you tend to start to have brain dysfunction related to memory, is what a lot of people know of. But you also you start to have problems with coordination. You start to have problems eventually with speech. Generally, any high order function we start to have problems with. Now, if you'll notice, a big thing to look at the two brains. One seems, to me at least, significantly smaller than the other. And sometimes in Alzheimer's, we get a reduction in brain tissue. And we end up seeing an exaggeration of what's called the sulci, which is plural for sulcus. And the sulcuses are basically these lines in between the raised brain areas. And those raised areas are called gyri, or the gyrus. Okay. We don't exactly know what causes Alzheimer's. There is some research indicating that it's related to a protein called amyloid. There's stuff indicating that it could be related to plaques, but we don't exactly know. And because of that, treatments that exist really only prolong the inevitable. And as disturbing as it might be the real reason somebody ends up dying from Alzheimer's and any other type of dementia, because Alzheimer's is a specific type of dementia, is essentially the brain actually ends up eventually just not telling the lungs or not telling the diaphragm to contract, which causes breathing. What we see here is a lumbar puncture, otherwise known as a spinal tap. So what we do with the spinal tap, and this is very important, the end of the spinal cord in most people is between T12 and L2. In fact, for most people, it'll basically be done by the bottom of the L1 vertebra. So we see here L5, L4, L3, L2, L1. Notice how the end of spinal cord is marked at the bottom of L1. Just to be sure, though, because I believe it's about 5% of the population will go to L2, will actually tend to do lumbar punctures at L3, L4 in order to collect cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And this is important because there can be infections or other conditions where we can examine cerebrospinal fluid for stuff that shouldn't be there. So if we have like a bacterial meningitis, we'll be able to find evidence of a bacterial presence, which would be able to allow us to treat the meningitis more effectively than, say, if we didn't do a CSF, and didn't collect the CSF, and we just started treating for bacterial meningitis when it actually could be a viral meningitis, and we're not going to see any progress. But it's important to collect it this low because if the needle were to puncture the spinal cord, we would end up with a lot of problems. Okay, you could paralyze the person from that spinal level down. Okay, and just to put that into perspective, pretty much T12 and below controls a lot of stuff at our hips and lower, okay? So an injury at T12 can really impact the ability for lower torso posture. It can impact our ability to flex our hips because of the specific muscles that are innervated by nerves that come from there. Whereas if we take it at L3, L4, we no longer have that solid individual cord anymore. The odds of damaging nerves is a lot lower at this point as well. And we also have single individual fibers running at this point. So again, the odds of injury are much lower. And damaging only one nerve root, for instance, is a lot less severe than damaging the entire cord. Because, for instance, we want to talk about the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve is L2, L3, L4 spinal levels. So those spinal roots kind of all join different parts together to create the femoral nerve. And that femoral nerve is what we see innervating a large portion of our upper thigh muscles, for instance, like the quadriceps. So you might not even see reduced function if there's even slight damage to just one of those three nerve roots. So words not built from from word parts. You'll see some of these very often. Migraine basically is just an extreme headache. Multiple sclerosis, this is a progressive disease. MS, paraplegia. Parkinson's disease, another progressive disorder. Sciatica, a condition related to the sciatic nerve. Seizures. Strokes, officially termed cerebrovascular accidents. Subarachnoid hemorrhage. So this is a bleed into the subarachnoid space. Syncope is a term for dizziness. And then a transient ischemic attack. This is what we would commonly call a mini stroke. So looking here, hemiplegia, paraplegia, and quadriplegia. What we see on C, we have 4 limbs paralyzed. That is quadriplegia. What we see on B is 2 limbs paralyzed. That is paraplegia. And what we see here is just 1/2 of the body paralyzed. And that is hemiplegia. It's pretty rare. Sometimes we can see this happen with strokes, where a person has a stroke on the left side of the brain and they can suddenly not move or feel the right side of the brain. A paraplegic, typically we see that with spinal injuries. Depending really how far down, these would be lower level injuries, into the thoracic spine and lower. Quadriplegia, a lot of people with quadriplegia, I would say, are relatively lucky but unlucky, because it's surprisingly low how low you have to damage your spinal cord in order to just stay alive, for instance. We can lose diaphragm function with damage above C5, which is pretty much level with your trapezius muscles, right above your shoulders. So it's typically going to occur from high-level spinal cord injuries. They can also not just be from injuries, though. There could be tumors on the spinal cord, and those tumors can cause a stenosis, which is a compression of the cord, and you can end up with paralysis. And a lot of times when that happens, it might not even be an operable tumor. So next, what we see here, hemorrhagic strokes. So again, a hemorrhagic stroke is when there's excess bleeding. This can come from ruptured blood vessels, come from aneurysms. We'll have in subarachnoid hemorrhages, again, the blood will bleed into the subarachnoid space, which will compress the brain. Intracranial hemorrhages occur within the actual brain tissue. Ischemic strokes, and this is basically the same thing that happens with a heart attack in the coronary arteries. We get the same thing happening in the brain. You can have a thrombosis or thrombus, where it basically, a thrombus or an embolus is just going to block and you get a loss of blood flow. When this happens relatively quickly and doesn't cause permanent damage, we have what's called a TIA. The most common blood vessel in the brain to experience a stroke, a blockage, is the middle cerebral artery, which would essentially be in this general area that I'm highlighting. Notice how it's aptly named for being in the middle of the cerebrum. So the subarachnoid hemorrhage, again, this is just another show. We see this, in blunt force trauma to the head. It's definitely something that needs treated very quickly. So we see a transient ischemic attack here. Again, this is different from a cerebrovascular accident because of the time frame. We typically don't have long-term permanent damage. Now, with someone that has a TIA, it's very likely that they could end up with a full-on stroke very soon. So looking at abbreviations. So again, what does this show? This shows a temporary blockage. It's a TIA, transient ischemic attack. What is this? The recorded electrical activity of the brain. This is an EEG. And that is all for the nervous system.